We got to get this House seat back.
Yeah.
We got to get this House seat back. It was ours for 50 years. We lost it. We're going to get it back. Now, to do that, it's going to take a lot of work. A lot of people have seen Democrats have already reserved $4 million. $4 million in ad buy for our opponent, Mary Peltola. Because they know she's going to have a hard time defending her record.
Yeah.
Hoorah!
Hard time defending her record. We're a red state. People often say, oh, we've gone blue, we've gone purple. We're not. We're red. Let me tell you how we know that's true. Because if we weren't a red state, why would Mary Peltola be trying to run like she's a conservative? You're trying to deceive the public. But her record won't let her now. It's up to us to make sure that our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, our family, they understand what she's been doing. Voting with Nancy Pelosi 90% of the time. Voting with Ilhan Omar 85% of the time. And enabling the Joe Biden agenda. You know, she's actually endorsed Joe Biden for president. She's telling you that Joe Biden needs 4 more years. I don't know if Joe Biden has 4 more years. But, you know, we're at a pivot point in our nation right now. We're at a pivot point. We can go the way of the Democrats, a socialist direction, or we can open it back up for competition, where merit wins, where excellence is valued. That's what built this nation. And Democrats want to take us down a different road. My son, I like to tell stories about my son. He's 12, okay? He comes back with all kinds of interesting stories. Help me illustrate some points. So he went out to a farm, Pioneer Peak Farm, Pyrus, out in the valley, with his class. And his job was that day, hey, you got to go dig out some potatoes. So he's out there, he's trying to find the very best potatoes. He's pretty proud of his potatoes. And his teacher says, okay, put these in this sack. I got a big potato sack. He puts it in the sack, goes back to his class at the end of the day, and they hand out the potatoes. And he comes home, he said, I'm pretty upset. Why? Well, I didn't get my potatoes. I got the big potatoes. I got somebody else's potatoes. I got these little things. Democrats want to take your potatoes and give you somebody else's smaller potato. But we got to value excellence, right? We got to value merit. That's how our economy has flourished. That's how we built the strongest nation in the world, because we value excellence. Now, we've got some challenges. Obviously, we can talk about some of these. We've got an immigration problem, right? I never thought I'd be talking about this in Alaska, but we're talking about it. We're talking about it a lot. I've talked to a couple of people here throughout this campaign who have actually shared personal stories of family members who have passed away because of fentanyl overdoses. Every state has become a border state. That's the truth. And it's sad. If you don't have a border, you do not have a country. Now, we have a very thin majority in the House. Okay? We all know that. But did you know they have a very thin majority in the Senate? Somehow the Democrats are able to stick together. Republicans keep compromising. We said that we would not pass one of these bills without border funding. We just did today, this morning.
63 billion?
If we're going to make a commitment, stick to it, in my view. Stick to that commitment.
Hoorah!
We've got a national debt absolutely out of control. And as others have said, it's hard to defend a bankrupt nation. We've got to get our financial house in order. There are so many people out there suffering from inflation. There's people here today that I've talked to that are struggling under inflation. People in rural Alaska struggling under Biden's inflation. And what has caused it? It's not the private sector. Democrats want to blame the private sector for high prices. It's government spending. It's printing money that didn't exist yesterday, that exists today. Government is creating these problems, and we've got to have people willing and ready and able to go down to DC and tell these people no more. Now, some of you were at this fundraiser. I'm going to retell a story I told again about my son, right? He comes home the other night and he's got an assignment. And we didn't know he had this assignment. He forgot he had the assignment. He runs in, oh no, I got to do this thing. So he rolls out the scroll. It's something that he's supposed to be drawn on, right? So he says, well, I have to draw on this thing. And he said, I got a woke teacher. And I got to finish this woke teaching assignment. And I said, now he's in 6th grade. So I'm going, okay, well, what's the woke teacher having you do? And he said, well, we got to think of ways, and we got to draw it down, ways that that energy use is affecting the Arctic. Right? How's energy use affecting the Arctic? So, not wanting him to get a bad grade on his assignment, we decided to get creative together. Right? I said, well, why don't we start by drawing a little nuclear power plant? Because after all, small nuclear drives down the cost of living in rural Alaska. Right?
Damn straight.
That's right.
Yeah!
I said, why don't we draw some of these windmills, okay? They're killing our Arctic birds. I said, why don't we draw some solar panels? Because they absorb so much heat, they're warming the Arctic. But in all seriousness, we have a culture battle to fight as well in this country. And we've seen things that I never thought we'd see in Alaska make their way over to even the Anchorage School District, right? Where children are being exposed to ideologies I don't think anybody in here supports, right? And they're subject to that every day. And they got instructors, and if they don't participate, cooperate, they're not going to get the good grades. This is their future. And they're put into these situations. We saw just this last week an activist judge here in the state of Alaska invalidate 20,000 homeschool students, right? Saying that they can't participate. They have to be forced back into a system that's failing. That's wrong.
Yeah, yeah!
So it would be nice if we could just talk about financial issues, fiscal conservatism, but we've also got to talk about cultural conservatism as well. Because the left wants, they want everything. Lieutenant Governor Craig Campbell got up here, and he talked about the Democrats' strategy. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, they get a step. Two steps forward, 1 step backward, they get a step. Republicans have to stop compromising with the Democrats and draw lines not in the sand, but in the granite. Because values are timeless. Values don't change with the times. Now, you're here, you want to ask questions. You want to know, where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on that? And I will tell you, as Republicans, there are a number of issues we're divided on. But I think it's important before you decide who you're going to support, you hear from me. You know what I believe. And you know, if I don't know something, I'm going to tell you. Okay? Someone in this role can't know everything. But we had an opportunity to get some questions. As Ann said, I have not seen these questions in advance. Did not ask to see the questions in advance. Did not ask anyone to send questions in advance. So whatever we get, I haven't seen it. And go ahead. Let's throw some questions out.
All right.
All right.
First, I'd like to thank the people who submitted questions for Nick. The first question is, what is your position on abortion and how will you message it?
Nice, easy question right up front. Look, I'm pro-life, okay? I'm pro-life. I want everyone here to know that. I believe life begins at conception. And I'm going to tell you a story. You know, this is maybe sound a little controversial, but I'm going to tell you something. If we went to Mars tomorrow, we found a little bacteria on Mars, what would the headline tomorrow be? Life on Mars. Don't tell me life doesn't begin at conception. Of course it does. That's a human life. So I'm pro-life. I am thrilled with the Dobbs decision. I think it's a great decision. It's a great advancement for the pro-life movement in this nation. And it's a conversation that's going to be happening at the state level. And it's going to be a challenging conversation, but it's a conversation that's long overdue. A lot of people on the left want to make this an all or nothing argument. Now they're going to have to defend their all or nothing argument in 50 states. And guess what? They're going to lose that. They're losing it all over the country. Because people understand we're talking about human life. So that's my view.
What is your position on amnesty for illegal immigrants?
No. Let me add to that. People who have entered our country illegally need to be sent home.
Yes. As the question is phrased, it says, what caucus will you join?
The Republican caucus, of course, 100%. There shouldn't be any question about that.
What are you personally doing to get rid of voting machines and going to same-day hand counting with paper ballots?
What am I personally doing?
Well,
That's an interesting question. I don't know there's a lot that I can personally do except for advocating for hand count ballots, paper ballots, right? Many of you will know I spent 20 years running a software company that I founded, okay? I've spent my entire career in tech. I don't actually come from the politics space. I probably should have mentioned that up front. My last name is Begich, but I was raised on by my conservative grandparents on my mother's side. Yeah.
Here, here.
And I've come up from business, right? And my business was technology. And so, you know, look, I ran a software company. You can make software do whatever you tell it to do. I think one of the things that needs to be done, particularly here in the state of Alaska, if we're going to be using ballot counting machines, if that's going to be something we use, which I prefer to use the hand count, let me make that clear, but if we're going to use these machines, we need to have open source software. So
Hell
you
yeah.
can see what the code is.
Yeah.
That's just rational. That's rational. And there's all kinds of systems right now that are open sourced all over the world because open source software, it turns out, has stronger security, right? The intent, when we talk about election integrity, right, my view is we had challenges in 2016 from the left who said that the election was hacked by the Russians. Okay? 2020, we had all kinds of questions about what happened in that election. Obviously, there's a bipartisan crisis of confidence in elections. The Democrats forgot about that. But if you're going to live in a constitutional republic, you have to make sure that the voters know that their vote counted. One person, one vote. That there's a chain of custody, right? So, that's my view. Yeah.
What is the first issue you would approach on day one of your term as a U.S. Congressman?
It's a great question. So, look, there's been Alaska-specific legislation in the past. ANCSA, ANILCA, right? Some of it good, some of it not so good. But we have had Alaska-specific carve-outs. What we're dealing with right now is an Alaska-specific series of carve-outs from Joe Biden. You know that one of the first votes by Joe Biden in the Senate was to say no to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline? This guy's been against our state from the beginning. He came in, that was 1973, that's how long he's been there. He came in the same year as Don Young. Okay, so look, we've got to have an Alaska-specific carve-out, an Alaska-specific package that resolves right-of-way access, right? Ensures that we have control over our lands. Federal government took some of the most promising mineral, oil, and gas prospects off the table from Alaska, selected them, assured us that we would have access to them, and is now pulling them off the table even this week. So we've got to do a better job communicating the value proposition of Alaska, why we are so important, why we need Alaska, not just for economic security, but for national security. We have nearly every critical mineral on the critical minerals list. We have base metals in abundance. We have precious metals. We have rare earths, believe it or not, in economic quantities in Alaska, down in Southeast and on the Seward Peninsula outside Nome. We have the resources to take our domestic supply chain and reinvigorate it. We can take it out of China's hands. But you got to have someone willing to do it in the White House and in the Congress. And so when we talk about what's the most important priority, that is a critical priority. We need to make sure that Alaska is understood by the rest of the Congress, is a priority for the rest of the Congress, and that we have a carve-out that prevents us from being assaulted by another Joe Biden.
Nick!
We got a question back here. Can we take that question? I don't know what this question is.
Well, that's okay. I'm just going to, if I could just get through these and then you can take
Okay, that's fine.
There's not that many left. How exactly should immigration be resolved? It's two parts. And how do you address someone who walked 2,000 miles with their children seeking a life for them?
That's an interesting question from a Republican in this room. But I don't know. I'm not assigning that to anyone. Okay. First off, how do you resolve the immigration question? There's a number of other countries that deal with migrant workforces. They're not immigrants, they're migrant workforces. They're temporary workers that come over, they've been vetted, they have specific approved roles that they can engage in. Maybe it's agriculture, maybe it's domestic help, whatever it is, that is commonly used around the world. And what we have right now is we have 10 million plus people that have come into the country. We don't know who they are, where they came from, or what they're doing when they get here. They don't pay taxes. They just kind of absorbed into the system. And it's costing everyone in this room and everyone outside this room a tremendous amount of money to support these folks, right? So we need to have legal immigration, and if necessary, legal migration. But we need to make sure, let me be 100% clear, we put the people of America first. And I don't want to skip the second part of the question, because I'm not going to dodge anything. So we're going to talk about the second part of the question. What do you say to someone who walked 2,000 miles with their kids? Okay, first off, 90% of the people here are single military-age men.
Exactly.
So we're talking about a very small portion of the number of people that are coming across the border, right? What I would say is, look, I have recognized life is challenging all over the world. There's people here. There's homeless all over the streets in Anchorage, right? And we're a generous people. The United States gives more than any other nation for all kinds of support, whether that be humanitarian support or military support. The pockets of the American people seem to be bottomless. They're not, right? But we're very generous people. But we can't take on all the problems of the world. We've got problems of our own, and we have to solve our problems first. That's right.
Support aid to Israel, Taiwan, and the Ukraine.
Do I support aid to Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine? So each one has to be dealt with separately in different ways. First of all, I believe if we're providing assistance, particularly military assistance to other nations, it needs to be in the form of a loan, not a grant.
Here, here.
And let me just illustrate a point about that. We live in Alaska. Who did we buy Alaska from? Russia, 1867. Why were they willing to sell Alaska to us?
They were
Because they were fighting a war in Ukraine, and it depleted their treasury. We got something for our assistance, our financial assistance at that time. We live here for that reason. We got to have a smarter foreign policy that, again, puts the people of our nation first. There's nothing wrong with that. Every other nation in the world does it, we should do it, right? So, do I support a loan to Israel? Yes, I would support a loan to Israel. Absolutely. They're our strongest ally in the Middle East, okay? They're a counterweight to terrorist nations like Iran. We need a strong Israel. Absolutely. In Ukraine, we've got to ask a serious question. What will another $100 billion do? Just nearly $100 billion just passed the House this morning. There were more Republicans who voted against it than voted for it, by the way. But what will that second $100 billion do that the first $100 billion didn't do? You know what the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is right now? 43. 43. They're outnumbered by Russians 4-1. I believe we need to be peace brokers. Many times in the past in our nation's history, we have been an agent for a catalyst for regime change. We become responsible for nations when we engage in that way, right? And I think we need to be brokers for peace. We've got 3 potential fronts with China, Taiwan, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Iran. We can't fight a 3-front war. So we need to be brokers for peace, in my opinion. Lastly, in Taiwan, yes, I believe we should support Taiwan. Taiwan is an economic engine. They're necessary for any technology that gets created in the world is coming through Taiwan. Now, there's a long-term plan to move a lot of that semiconductor manufacturing over to domestic or friend-shoring locations, but right now it's concentrated in Taiwan. You lose Taiwan, you have a major problem. And let's not forget, China is a communist nation, for goodness sakes, right? And Taiwan is freedom-loving democracy. So I believe we should be supporting Taiwan.
How would you address the question of Supreme Court justices' ethics?
So, well, I definitely think that a Supreme Court should have an ethics code. I don't think that should be in question, right? But we need to have a clear separation of powers, right? We have a constitutional separation of powers. You cannot have the Congress imposing a set of standards on the judicial branch because the Congress is a political entity. And the judicial is supposed to be non-political. Supposed to be, right? But I think that needs to be self-managed.
Tell us what makes you prepared to represent Alaska in Washington, D.C.
Look, you know, I think we've had too many lifetime politicians in D.C. And I don't think that the founders intended for lifetime politicians to be a thing. I think we know that. We need people from the real world. We often hear politicians talk about the private sector as though it's some curiosity over there in the corner on a shelf. That's 90% of the jobs in this country coming from the private sector, right? The sector is the government. The private life is private life. Government back in its lane. And the people to do that are not people from government, they're people from real life. So I don't come with DC's perspective. That's probably clear at this point, right? There are folks in DC who want concentrated power. I talked to Don Young about this personally. Don Young lamented many times the lack of authority in the committee chairs. When Don Young was a committee chair, he had the power to move things through the House. The concentration of power and leadership has made things very difficult for members in the House, right? And look, I think that the restoration of regular order that's been attempted, we need to keep going for that. We need to keep going for that. These omnibus bills or minibus bills, they prevent us from actually cutting government and putting it back in its lane.